World champion wrestlers do not grow on trees, even in Palo Alto. But some 50 years ago, on a leafy residential street in the city, two young brothers grew up doing what young brothers often do. They wrestled. The difference was Dave and Mark Shultz never stopped wrestling, and they reached heights never attained by brothers in the sport, before or since. Their story, though, had an unlikely beginning. Dave, the older brother by a year, was not known as a great athlete in grade school. Mark was better known as a gymnast. But in the early 70s, during junior high, Dave somehow caught the wrestling bug.
First time I met Dave was, he was a freshman. He was at the junior high. I was at Palo Alto High School, a junior. And I met Dave. He came to a practice, which I thought was peculiar because you don't see many junior high kids want to work out with the high school kids. I wasn't really impressed. He was a little pudgy kid that loved the sport, obviously, but I wasn't sure it was the correct sport for him.
We called him Pudge all the way through high school, but he just didn't have the wrestler's physique. But he was such a studious person. He wrote down everything. If he could show me a new move, okay, he'd go over to a pad and write it down.
Dave became so immersed in his new favorite sport that he even wore his wrestling singlet beneath his clothes to school. He initially took his lumps, but learned from everyone. And by his sophomore year, he was a force to be reckoned with in the Central Coast section. By his senior year at Palo Alto High, Dave would win a state championship and senior amateur titles. By then, he had introduced his brother to the sport, and Mark made the most of his introduction.
I was a student at Stanford. Dave was in middle school, I believe, and his younger brother was participating in the club gymnastics program at Stanford. And it was the end of practice, and Dave said, you know, if Mark ever wants to wrestle, if he ever decides to do this, he could be really good. And so I took this throwing dummy, which was named Bill, and so I did what's called a souffle on Bill, where I arch my back and throw him over the top of me. And I said, so Mark, do you think you can do that? And he said, yeah. So he grabbed Bill and just threw him perfectly, as if he'd done it a million times.
As a junior, looking for a more physical sort of competition, Mark finally made the switch to the wrestling mat, but given his late start, struggled to hit his stride in the sport until 2 years later as a senior.
He didn't win a tournament all league season long until we got to the league finals, and then he just started blossoming because he was such a great athlete. I mean, he really is a super athlete. He won the league finals. All right, so that kind of lit a fire underneath him, and he throws a backflip. And after he wins it, all right, great. That became his trademark, throwing a backflip after they raise his hand. Then he goes to the regionals, he wins that, throws his backflip. And he goes to CCS, and he wins that. He wants to throw a backflip after every flip. I said, no, that's for the championship. You know, if you win the championship, maybe we can do it, you know. Finally, in the finals, when they raise his hand, he goes over to me, he says, now can I throw a backflip, coach? I said, now you can throw it. So he throws the backflip on that.
Mark eventually wound up with his brother on the wrestling team at the University of Oklahoma, where they won a combined 4 national individual championships. As a junior, Mark was named the NCAA tournament's outstanding wrestler and then capped off his senior year in 1983 with a 3rd straight title. By then, Dave was out of school and competing internationally, winning a freestyle world championship. And with the 1984 Olympic Games looming in Los Angeles, there was no question about Dave and Mark's next mission. They wanted to be the first brothers ever to win wrestling gold medals at the same Olympics. As they trained, they challenged themselves and each other on and off the mat, day after day, growing as close as they'd ever been.
To put in the hours and to sweat each other down to get to weight, you know, you got to love each other to push each other that hard. You really do.
They pushed each other really hard, but they were also rough on each other. If they worked out too often, because they both assisted me when I was coaching at Stanford for 3 years, and I had to limit how often they'd wrestle each other, otherwise there'd be blood.
In Los Angeles, the world quickly learned who the Shultz brothers were. Dave rolled through the 163-pound freestyle competition to win his gold. Mark, at 180 pounds, took a much more interesting path. In his first match of the Olympic tournament, he won easily, but in the process broke the arm of a Turkish wrestler, and a raging controversy ensued.
An hour and something goes by, and then the Turks finally file a protest that, you know, it's an illegal hold. They looked at the reviews on the film, and it shows that the arm, if it's here, it's legal. If it gets over the back, it's illegal. Just when it's just invisible line, where it got over the line. So they want Mark disqualified and thrown out of the tournament, because they say if you win a match because of breaking a guy's arm or hurting them, and with an illegal match, you're thrown out of the tournament.
He was ruled to have lost the match, but was allowed to continue in the tournament. This meant that to win the gold medal, Mark had no margin for error. He would have to win every successive match, and he did. The two brothers had their 2 golds.
My heart was in my throat, you know, and my head's ready to explode just with the pride that I had when those guys won.
Nobody seemed, you know, really surprised that they were doing what they're doing, but I was just, you know, I can't believe this, you know. I was really, really happy.
After the Los Angeles Olympics, the Shultz wrestling dynasty continued. Mark won world titles in 1985 and 1987, as well as a Pan American Games gold medal. Dave won 5 World Cup championships and 2 Pan American Games golds. But in 1996, tragedy struck. Dave was pointing toward a comeback at the Atlanta Olympics when he was shot and killed by John DuPont, a mentally ill wrestling benefactor that Dave had befriended. The entire wrestling world was shaken. Mark continues to honor his brother by coaching the sport both men loved. And wherever wrestling people gather in the South Bay, the Shultz brothers' names are never far from their lips.
And when you go through the pain and the agony and the suffering that wrestlers go through together, you have a bond that's unbelievable. You really do. And I've always said, give me a wrestler in a tragedy, a fire or a flood or something. I'll take a wrestler at my side anytime. And these guys have gone through the ultimate.
Dave and Mark Shultz have been honored as inductees in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. Their remarkable accomplishments can be summed up simply. They combined to win more NCAA, World, and Olympic championships than any American brothers in wrestling history. But tonight, as they join San Jose's Hall of Fame, the people that grew up with them and nurtured them understand exactly why they could take on the world and win. Maybe Dave and Mark Shultz worked harder than anyone and wanted it more. Or maybe, just maybe, the world was simply no match for the power of brotherly love.